Hi, this is Tim, a producer on Pod Uni. We just wanted to let you know there's a few more pops and plosives in this audio than we'd like, but there's also some lovely spring bird sounds in the background, which we think is apropos for an interview with the Birds of Paradise producers. Enjoy the podcast.
Kia ora koutou, and welcome back to Pod Uni, the podcast about podcasting. I'm Collin Bjork, and in this episode, I am thrilled to introduce you to Bird of Paradise Productions. That's the dynamic duo of Noelle McCarthy and Daniell. In this episode, you will hear them discuss the origins of their production company, Bird of Paradise Productions, and also we'll go into a deep dive about their approach to interviewing and storytelling, which are quite intertwined. They've produced many podcasts over their time as podcast producers, award-winning podcasts, I should emphasize. And while other episodes of Pod Uni that I've done tend to focus on a single podcast, here I've asked them questions right across their archive of podcasts so that we can get a clearer sense of how interviewing might function differently in different stories and how storytelling might function differently across different topics. Now, to give you a little bit more background on Noelle and John. John is an award-winning nonfiction writer. He's also written TV drama, fiction, and other journalism, both here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and overseas in Europe. And Noelle McCarthy has interviewed everyone from James Cameron to the Dalai Lama over the course of the last decade or so. She's worked as a presenter, a producer, a podcast maker, writing columns, features, essays, reviews, and so on. And I'm really thrilled that they took the time on a bright, sunny spring day in their Wairarapa home to share their expertise with us. I hope you enjoy this episode. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Welcome, and I'm really grateful to be here with both of you. Can you please introduce yourselves?
My name is Noelle McCarthy, and I'm one half of Bird of Paradise Productions.
And my name's Daniell. I am the other half of Bird of Paradise Productions.
Super. Thank you for taking the time today. Can you tell me a little bit about the origin story of Bird of Paradise? What's the background?
Noelle, I think this is you were the start.
I'll have to go all the way back to 2016, which is a long way now.
Well, to understand it.
To understand the present, we must go back to the past. Podcast cliche number one. This company had its roots in 2016 when Radio New Zealand National asked me if I would make a podcast. So Paul Thompson, the CEO, wanted to talk about sort of what I'd be interested in and what might be interesting for a listener. And we landed on aging. And so the podcast I made was called A Wrinkle in Time. And it took me so much longer than I thought it was going to, thus establishing a theme in my working life in podcasting. But what happened was I sort of got halfway through and was overwhelmed by the amount of work and the amount of interviews I'd done, and sort of was stuck with it, and there wasn't necessarily any institutional knowledge there in Aotearoa, because this, as far as I knew, was the first one. Certainly the first one RNZ had made. So I rang up Radiolab, who were the podcasts that I used to listen to at the time. And obviously they're really lovely, really collegial folks at Radiolab. And so they gave me an interview. And so I asked them.
Who's they? Was it Jad Aberpad? Or?
It wasn't. It didn't go all the way to Jad. It was one of the helpful lads in the back room, I think, who gave me 35 minutes of his time. And I explained the situation. I said I was in New Zealand and I was making a narrative podcast and I had some questions. And the first question I asked was about writing the scripts. And I had a question about drafting in particular because I wasn't sure how I was doing it. And he said, I think I remember this right, he said we usually go through 18 script drafts.
Wow.
By the time we're ready to work with the composer. So the words script draft and composer were really standing out to me. So I said, okay. And then at the end of the interview, when I was completely overwhelmed, I said, if hypothetically speaking, it was just you and you were working by yourself on a narrative podcast, what other member of the team would be indispensable to you? If you could only have one other person working with you and not the full team you have, who would that person be? And he said it would be a script editor. You have to have a script editor. That is the single most important thing you need. I mean, he said that was his opinion, but he'd made a lot more podcasts than I had or anyone I knew had. And so I went home and looked around me and saw the writer of fiction and nonfiction sitting at the kitchen table, slightly underemployed. And
self-unemployed at that time. I'd been working in TV.
You had, yeah.
I'd been working in TV drama, and I was very enthusiastic. I thought this whole idea of podcasting sounded great.
And in fairness to him, he was doing it anyway. So I said,
"What does that mean? You were doing it anyway?"
Well, no. I mean, I only just started listening, but
listening.
But Noelle's job seemed very exciting to me, and she seemed
overwhelmed.
Yeah, kind of overwhelmed, and sort of not. It was like, I hate this kind of thing. And I was like, what do you? I was trying to pitch people ideas for TV at that time and not really getting anywhere. And here she was in the middle of having to do something, but at least with the traction of a real story and going out and interviewing people. And
critically, he hadn't done the interview, so he was able to bring a really fresh eye to everything that I had done, whereas I was sort of drowning in the middle of it. And so he was able to plot the path through and also give me feedback on the rough cuts, which was critical. That was the thing that I didn't have at the time. I remember I'd bring them home to you on a CD. I had a CD at one
But there was
point.
and story structure and all that sort of stuff. So it was a lucky kind of confluence of things, because I'd done some journalism, but I'd also written fiction, non-fiction, and done some TV drama. So podcasting was new, but I had some sort of
He had a
building
background.
block skills.
Storytelling wasn't new.
Kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. And then...
and he had a framework as well for understanding it. At that point, I'd been in radio for a long time, and I had a lot of experience as an interviewer and as a host and as a radio producer, but I didn't have any experience in storytelling besides kind of enjoying it, So it was really lucky. It was a really lucky phone call, and I'm very grateful to the lads at Radiolab for booking me in for a slot, but also that John was able to kind of share those skills. And that's what got us thinking about this as an enterprise, as something we could do.
And because the other thing was the point with the TV drama that I'd been trying to do that was very frustrating, because there were so many different layers of power that you had to get through, because you had to pitch it to producers, to a production house, and you talk to various different ones, and then they would go to a network or whatever, and then the network might go to a fund. So by the time, and you're sitting at the bottom, waiting to hear, and you just hear nothing for months. And then maybe something will happen, or maybe it won't. Whereas by setting up our own production company, we could go and get traction straight away and talk to people.
Which isn't to say that you still don't have to go through the funding hoops, but at least you are self-directed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that was the name of that podcast, just for the listeners?
The name of that podcast was A Wrinkle in Time.
Yes, great. And that was with RNZ. And when did Bird of Paradise come about relative to that?
Pretty soon after that, 2017. I think the same year our daughter was born.
Yeah, it was at the start of that year, or sort of, I can't remember, Christmas. Anyway, so then we had the idea of, 2016, it came out of... we had two kind of political earthquakes in that year. It came out almost immediately. We hadn't necessarily thought, we were just starting to think about whether we'd set up or not as a company. And you had first Brexit, and then the arrival of Donald Trump.
Our election.
and both of them were based on, immigration and the sort of weaponizing of immigration. We both lived as immigrants in different countries, and New Zealand is a kind of a country where there's a lot of immigration, and we felt that it was a legitimate question that people kind of were ducking away from, and that there was something that was worth talking about. And you had interviewed Paul Spoonley.
I knew Paul Spoonley, and I knew his work from previous interviews, and I knew that was the sort of conversation that Massey had, and sort of an interest in and a stake in, really, you know, a stake in the quality and the level of that sort of conversation.
Yeah.
And so we went back, I think we spoke to Duncan Grieve actually, first of
Yeah.
all, to say, look, we're thinking of setting up a company. What do you think? Because the spin-off had just started, was only a year or two old, I think, possibly at that time. We had a coffee with him in town or whatever, and he was like, look, you know, why not? It sounds great.
He said to us, you only need one. He said, you need one to get started. And he said, you know, it might come down to someone in a marketing department who likes podcasts. That's what he said, which I thought,
Wow.
you know, has always stayed with me, because we didn't realize that what we were doing was the beginning of one strand of our business. You know, those collaborations with institutions went on to be a feature of our business and a strand of it. But we also have projects that get public funding as well. You know,
That was the first 3 years were all partnerships, collaborations, really. That were sort of self-funded through. We did some stuff with the spin-off.
Some stuff with Auckland Zoo, some stuff with Te Papa, some stuff with Auckland Museum. So the Venus Envy podcast, and that went through the spin-off as well. And that was because Auckland Museum were having an exhibition and they were thinking about marketing in a different way. You know, they were thinking about how they wanted to position it and what they wanted to do. So that was great.
Did you have to seek out those partnerships, or did they come to you after you started Bird of Paradise? Or
I think you... Well, so certainly you rang Paul Spoonley. I remember that. I remember the call, and you repeated it to me. So
the great thing about Paul was he is he was very lateral. Like he was a lateral. I think he was like, so a podcast. Okay, I mean, let's talk about it. What would it look like? And there was a lot of work that we needed to do in terms of lining up the platform and talking about the content and talking about how it would be presented. One of the things that was really important for us was to have a live event, because I'd been hosting a series of live events at Auckland Museum. So we went back to them to talk to them about the possibility of including a live component to the podcast, which I'd never heard of anywhere. I don't even know why we did that. We just thought, well,
I think we were trying to
capture the audio.
Well, I think we were also trying to say, in terms of conversations, in terms of trying to kind of have a healthy conversation around immigration, and that was one of the...
And that was something RNZ were really interested in.
Our fundamental thing was like, you can't let everyone in, you can't keep everyone out, so you're going to have to discuss
a setting.
A setting somewhere. And I mean, it is interesting. It feels like we solved it, but I mean, like 8 years on, people are still having kind of this discussion,
still talking about it. Yeah.
But that thing about solving it's interesting, because I remember that's one of the first things John said to me. When I was covered in script drafts for the aging podcast and sort of pulling my hair out, he's like, you don't have to solve it. You just have to present it. You just have to tell the story in a compelling way. And that was before we'd really even had a serious conversation about the kinds of narrative podcasts we wanted to make, but that was a penny drop moment for me in terms of tackling complex subjects. You don't have to solve that. And if you are trying to solve it, a listener will know that. And it's kind of a turn off. It's not, but it is a challenge when you're writing it.
And so looking back at that period of Bird of Paradise to now, how has the production company changed, or is it still the same through and through? And
still the same fundamental principles. We haven't expanded particularly, but we did build out. I mean, the first 3 years, I don't think financial. I mean, we were, in terms of the, sustainability of it, we were kind of more digging into our own savings and making enough money. There was a long period of... And I was
moonlighting as an MC and doing different work. It certainly was not, I won't say an expensive hobby, but it wasn't. Maybe it was a loss leader.
So it was important, and we were learning craft and all that sort of thing all along the way. And they were sort of smaller stories, as it were, to begin with. And then, our dimension changed when we started getting New Zealand On Air funding, I think.
Well, two things happened. We moved down to Featherston, which was a fantastic... So Bird of Paradise now operates out of the Featherston Bureau. at the bottom of the North Island. And so we moved down here, which was a great way of keeping our costs down and giving us a lot more financial freedom, I think, out of the pressure of a big city, even though you've got travel costs and all the rest of it when you're working on a project. But then we also had the pandemic, which, as it happened, we had 2 projects kind of in production over that period, didn't we?
We had several in the end. I mean, it was a sort of 2 or 3 year period. Yeah. So anyway, so that was...
And we had made that move into public funding by then, as well as the partnerships model. That was still ongoing, and we still do that. We still partner with institutions, and but we were also going for New Zealand On Air funding, which enabled us to be more ambitious, I think, about the projects we were taking on.
That was a jump shift, I think. And it meant that we were no longer working with material from a partner as such as, being able to do more or less what we wanted.
Which one was the first New Zealand On Air, do you recall?
I think getting better. A Year in the Life of a Māori Medical Student with Emma Wahipehana was funded. There was a co-fund between RNZ, a short-lived co-fund between RNZ and New Zealand On Air. It was only one round, I think, and there was funding within that ring fence for Māori projects. And so we were funded under that. It's not around anymore, unfortunately, but that was our beginning. That was the first time we applied for funding and got it.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly glad Bird of Paradise took the leap and has been doing very well in the years since then. One thing that you guys seem very, very skilled at is interview technique. And you've interviewed everyone from the Prime Minister twice, I think, to everyday blokes about their masculinity, right? All kinds of people. Tell us a little bit about how you approach your interviews when you're preparing.
Well, you're the professional interviewer. I just blunder around, really. So, yeah, you go. I mean,
I was going to say that often gleans riches, though. Your so-called blundering around. They underestimate him. I think it's been an evolution. That's the interesting thing, is that, like, everything I learned through live radio in the first instance. And a lot of that you have to unlearn for podcasts, I think. And what I do mostly now is I do interviews in live settings, in front of an audience. And that's not the same as interviewing for podcasts either. And it's funny, because of the division of labor in our in Bird of Paradise, I'm mostly bringing material back to John. And so I get extremely targeted feedback, Collin, if the material is not up to scratch or up to standard. And one bit of feedback that I got quite early on was like, this is too stilted, this is too formal, you're taking too long to get to that, because he's got to listen to all of this and edit it all. And so I overcorrected, and then got some feedback that you're laughing over the top of the person, you're talking to them like they're your best friend, and it's 11 o'clock at night, this is unusable, there's too much of you in it. So I had to overcorrect again. I don't recognise any of that. I'm sure my Otter transcripts will tell the story.
Well, yeah.
But it's very interesting, because what works in a live setting doesn't always, in a live radio setting doesn't necessarily work in podcasts. And the other evolution for me was, when I was on radio, the people who you're interviewing, the process by which they get into the studio means that they've usually done something. They've written a book, they're in the news, they're a politician, they're, for whatever reason, they have gone through a process where they've been chosen by a producer. They've come in, sometimes they have those skills, they're very practiced. Whereas, as you know, like with podcasts, it's often the opposite of that. Sometimes these people have never spoken to someone before. And, John and I laugh about it, but we have a habit of talking to people who, for whatever reason, don't want to talk to us, or it's not in their best interests. John found this with the service kind of really dramatically. Like, it's not in their best interest to be talking to podcasters on tape. And yet, in the service, I don't know if he talked necessarily, but certainly, or didn't talk.
Oh yeah, well you find different ways of doing it. But yeah.
Can you unpack that difference between live radio interviewing and podcast interviewing? And you couched it kind of as a spectrum. What are some of the key differences between those two? For you?
So someone said to me very early on, when I was at student radio in Auckland, they said a radio interview is a very inefficient way of gathering information. If you wanted information from someone, you could just send them a form and they'd send it back to you. So when you're interviewing someone on the radio, to me, it's always been as much about creating a mood or a feeling or a dance, a piece of theatre, as it is in actually getting information. And there's lots of different contexts in which the information is paramount. Like the first job I ever had on the radio or involved interviewing Helen Clark, who was the Prime Minister at the time, first thing in the morning on a Monday, and that was, highly informational, quite high pressured. She does not and did not suffer fools gladly, Helen Clark. So, that was a kind of a high pressure formal situation. Whereas sometimes if you're talking to an author or you're talking to a creative person, you want to get a sense of their work as well. And that needs to come across in a kind of a, in an ambient way. And also it's about listening. It's about that relationship you have with whoever you're interviewing, because that's something that an audience and a listener responds to. And that is true in podcasts too, I think. That is true in any relational situation you're in with somebody. You want them to be as comfortable and as honest as possible, telling their story, and sometimes you're talking to them about the worst thing that ever happened to them or the best thing that ever happened to them or a regret, or, you run the gamut emotionally. And with podcasts, the other difference with the narrative podcasts we make, that that's going to be edited. As a rule, we don't really use massive chunks of interviews. That is going to be taken by John and sort of synthesized into a layered and edited script and presentation. So you're keeping that. I'm keeping that in the back of my head also. And then plus you're out in the field, so there's cicadas and trucks and, people coming into the room, whatever else, there are those considerations as well, none of which I ever had to contend with in radio. That's a very mediated environment, whereas podcast environments are the opposite, really. Anything could happen, and sometimes it does.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a different way of preparing, like when you're interviewing Helen Clark or Jacinda Ardern, these people in positions of power, right?
Yeah.
Versus you've interviewed people who've experienced, violence and kind of everyday citizens, people who've been treated poorly by the systems or by the people in power. Do you prepare differently for the different types of interviewees?
I think yes and no. And I'll answer the second part first, because every interview, the success of every interview is about connection. You've got to connect. And so that connection, that human connection is in the moment. You've got to be able to make the person comfortable enough to keep talking to you and to want to keep talking to you and to be honest with you and all of those things. And then that goes back to the first part of your question, and my answer is yes, they are very different, because the preparation required is different for everybody. Interviewing politicians is quite straightforward in one sense, because there's always setup. You always have to go through a level of their office or their media person, whoever, and you don't have to tell them exactly what we're going to ask them, but we do have to give them, for both of those Jacinda Ardern interviews, I think the second one was Good Ancestors, John. And we had to talk about climate change and all of the different human-assisted climate change questions that, might come up in that interview and the policy stuff. And then the first interview with Jacinda Ardern was about Me Too and feminism. And I think it happened just after the Women's March, after the election of Donald Trump. And that was a funny one in a way, because even though we'd done all that prep, but what happened on the day, we were doing that interview at Auckland Museum, and they ran late, and I was meant to be, they were taking her around the exhibition, which was a sort of politics and feminism exhibition up there. And they said, we're out of time. And I was like, no, well, you can't be. I need this. This is a podcast. And they said, do you want to get in the car and do it in the back of the car with her? And she was driving over to the North Shore. And I said, sure. Okay. It was the first time in my whole life. I was saying this to John the other day. It was the first time I forgot to press play. I was so, I got in and the mic was hot and I was, in my head it was, and I was going and I was like, got to make the most of this, so me too, blah, 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 whatever I was saying, whatever my, devastating opener was, and then look down and there's no red button. She's talking, she's started. And I thought, turn it on, move on. But it was great because suddenly you're in that, we're very tightly sitting together and, I didn't know where the car was going. It was one of those situations where you're sort of, you don't know what's going to happen next, but the prep is good. You do prepare and you do try and game it out. I mean, we always try to game it out, don't we? And we're often wrong.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it tends to be sort of something unexpected happens quite quickly.
Do you role play? Did you play one of the prime ministers at once over the dinner table?
No, not so much that. No. I mean, we write out a question line, like you've done basically, so a question line, think about what we want to hear, and then try and know that well enough before you go in and then follow. Yeah, I'm more shambolic in the sense that I will try to get into a conversation, as it were, and perhaps bring a little bit more of myself. I feel like that's the way of getting some empathy because I'm such a fool that they'll take pity on me.
Well, you're very interesting because John's very tall. It's a great icebreaker. You use what you've got in certain situations where, and usually they'll go, oh, you're very tall, or how's the weather up there, or something like that. It's just a little thing that allows us to kind of, because, you're very conscious. We're going into people's spaces and we're often asking for an intimate moment. We're asking for that sort of connection, and whatever breaks the ice is good, whatever. But sometimes you have to do an interview on the fly too. Sometimes it happens when you're not expecting it, that someone will call you. So, with Dear Jane, which was a podcast that I made. Award-winning. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Congratulations.
You told me that news, actually. I didn't know.
Really?
When there was a moment during that when one of the participants just rang me back. I hadn't been able to get in touch with him. So we're sort of having this encounter without necessarily me having planned for it. But John and I had lots of conversations about how it might go and what might happen. So there was a bit of prep there.
But you were quite nervous about it as well.
Yeah.
It was difficult.
Before I ask about Dear Jane and interviewing, I just wanted to say the audio of the Jacinda Ardern interview in the car. When I realized that you were in the car, I thought, damn, she got good audio in the car. That's hard. I was very impressed by that.
Thank you so much. When I turned it on, yes.
Yes. Oh, that's good. That's a good story. Tell me more about Dear Jane, right? There's some tricky interviewing there. And it's clear that you also developed a relationship with Jane over that time, but also with the person who we call Dan in that. But there's a bunch of, you mentioned in that podcast, actually, do you want to top line the podcast just for listeners real quick?
Dear Jane is it's Jane's story, and she's a woman in her 40s who is reevaluating a relationship that she had with her youth leader of her church youth group that began when she was 14. It actually started when she was 13. That was when he first told her he had feelings for her when she was 13 and he was 24. And she's looking back at that relationship with the distance of time, and a relationship that at the time she believed was loving and consensual and all of those things, and reframing it with a lot of questions and with a knowledge of the sort of damage, the long tail of damage that it's left in her life over the passage of decades.
Yeah. And it's a powerful story of that kind of audio documentary, that storytelling style. Can I ask, you mentioned that like you had quite a few phone calls with this person named Dan that didn't end up making it into the tape. And I don't know if that was a script editor element but also like, can you talk about that interviewing experience, which seems to be, and maybe how it works in contrast with your interviews with Jane, right? Those seem like very different things.
Well, that was a new one for me, and it was something I was very grateful to have John in the house, in the same house as me for, because ethically that was really difficult, because I rang Dan and, told him what we were doing and asked if he wanted to talk to me and to meet me. And he didn't want to, but he said, I'll go away and think about it and I'll get back to you, if I've if I want to. And then he rang back and he wanted to talk to me, but he kept saying, I want this to be off the record. It's just you and me talking. And, I would say to John, how can I use this? Are we able to use this? And, the obvious answer was that we could use my side of the conversation, right? And I think it was Patrick Radden Keefe who we took that from, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Wind of Change podcast, I think, was initially that little technique of
one side of the conversation.
But yeah, and it was complex for you, I think, emotionally as well, wasn't it? Because there were moments when you felt like you empathized with him and wanted to empathize with him because it was also helpful for the story and you wanted to hear us. And then you realized that you were listening to him for 30 minutes, kind of justifying himself, and you were giving a certain amount of succor to someone who you didn't necessarily agree with, but you didn't necessarily want to be.
It was really, it was very layered. It was a very layered experience because on the one level, Dan and Jane had a sexual relationship that started when she was 14,
And he was over a decade.
And he was over a decade older. He was her church youth group leader. Like legally even, he was on very dangerous ground, acknowledging the relationship to me. But he didn't deny it. He did not deny it at any point. And I asked him some very specific questions and he did not deny it. So there was that. Then there was also the fact that he had a very different conception of it. He would say, she broke my heart. She broke up with me, and so, and also he hadn't talked to anyone about this. And so I became this sort of person that he would just check in with, which was very, it was very weird.
Put a lot on you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it was also like from the story side of things, it was very important. It was a very important part of the story because I remember John said to me, when I was saying to him, to Dan, why should he be on the podcast? What's a good reason? And John said to me, well, if he isn't, there'll be a gap. There will be a gap in the narrative. There'll be a gap in the testimony and an audience will fill in that gap, which I think we do as human beings, right? Like that's how we do it. And so I'd tell him that, but then I'd find myself just listening to him like any other person and listening to his regret and all of these things. But then, of course, there was Jane who wanted to know. She wanted to know what he was saying to me. And I had to be really careful with that. I had to be careful for her as well.
But then you had the whole question around whether or not the two of them were to meet up.
Yeah, because she really wanted to meet and she was really clear about that. And I had spoken to a psychologist who's on the podcast, in fact, Catherine Gallagher, who's a great psychologist down in Christchurch, who does a lot of work with survivors of sexual abuse. And she said, look, a meeting like that is fraught unless both parties are really clear what it's for and have done the work. So there was that. And I was thinking about that a lot, and Jane was very clear what she wanted. But you'd hear, if you listen to the podcast, there is a moment where I feel like we're both at breaking point with the whole thing, with the whole enterprise. And that's when we went down to Christchurch. But we worked our way through it. But that was an example of why having someone in the house who does the same job as you is a great and, a great boon.
It does seem like that you became so much more than an interviewer in that podcast, right? You became part-time therapist, part-time listener, part-time
and I was
confidant, part-time, like a lot of roles that you aren't doing when you're a radio interviewer. That's right. For a major broadcaster.
No, you're not. But every good interview, I think, is an exercise in empathy. Like you've got to, because then you can. If you zone in on the person and you have that connection, then you can ask the questions, that they'll respond to. But yeah, that went well beyond it. And I was out of my depth on several occasions and had to be really clear that actually I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a therapist. And,
The upside of it was that we actually, it meant that you had access. The way we structured the story was that you were able to bring Jane to access, to have access to a lawyer, to a psychologist.
Yeah.
And
that was your idea.
Yeah.
You were saying systemic, and I think that was a really important point because it is about the systems that in some ways failed and now have it.
I think the point is in those situations, it's super. You're treating a very, very fine line ethically around. Jane had come to you to begin with, wanting to talk about it, but there is, at a given moment, it's like, well, is it ethical to continue to do this at all? And you can do that as a kind of, it's great tape, isn't it? Because it's raise the stakes. But also, it's like if you are going to engage with it as a human, you need to be very, very careful. And the whole thing, you have to be aware that the whole thing could tip over. And if it tips over, what does that mean for everyone involved?
Yeah.
And so, anyway, I mean, it was a very, very complicated, bit of podcast.
It's funny though, because like in a funny way, I think the service, John's podcast, set us up for that. Like those crossing of lines, when you're interviewing your own mum about her top secret background.
Yeah, you want to tell us a little bit about that? Actually, top line the service briefly, and then tell us a little bit about your approach to interviewing technique.
Well, so the service was a story about Cold War espionage in New Zealand in the 1980s. And because my mother and my stepfather had both worked for New Zealand's intelligence services, the SIS, and so I knew some of the stuff from the inside already, as it were, and that's which made interviewing my mother quite complicated. In fact, I got Guy on to do it in the first instance. So I brought Guy on down. Mum was I think she was 80, 79 at the time, and
just say who Guy on is.
Oh, so Guy Espiner, Radio New Zealand journalist, very, highly decorated investigative reporter, and who we'd been talking about this playing pool one night. We were mates, and I kind of told him the story behind the service, but that we, I suppose, is the central thread of the story, and he was kind of gobsmacked and like, well, we must do it, and anyway. We put it together over a series of months, and it was very frustrating because we got a lot of information very quickly, but even Mum was kind of reticent to say too much about anything. And obviously there's, with someone like your own mother, there's this big hinterland of stuff that already and that you bring to it, and she's like, well, I'm not necessarily comfortable saying that on tape or whatever. So
you were in the horrors, weren't you?
Well, it wasn't so much that I was in the horrors, but it was, the difficulty was a guy had come down from Auckland, and it was still, I don't think we hadn't pressed, we hadn't necessarily decided that we were going to go forward with the project. And if Mum was going to be like, oh, I'm not saying that, then it was suddenly going to be potentially quite complicated to actually make the series. But anyway, we got over the line.
That's interesting, right? Because you're saying that, the way the key to good interviewing is this relationality, getting people to open up. In this case, it's your own mum. You've already got the relationship. You're like, this is pretty.
But what he did, which was really smart, was he got her on the detail, because she was sort of minimizing it and playing it down, which is because she's a modest person. But you started saying, what about the handbags, Mum? What about the two-way mirrors? And suddenly there's this whole world of spycraft opening up in front of you. She's talking about those cars that they were driving, right, at like 100 k's an hour.
Yeah, so it was, luckily I did have enough background information from it to be able to say, yes, but you did do these things. Because she was like, oh, no, I wasn't a spy. No, I was, glorified secretary kind of thing.
So pointing to the specifics, that the key details, tactile material things in that case opened up a bit of the story in the interview then. Yes,
and funnily enough, yes, in a funny sort of way, it was the clothes were interesting actually, because one of the things that comes up, more or less tangentially, but of course she has this vision as a woman. She has this different vision of identifying people in the space. So in the early 1970s, the KGB had sent a guy into New Zealand, into Wellington, and they were out looking for him, and she picked him up because of the nature of the fabric and the texture he was wearing, and which I don't think a man necessarily would have at the time.
Fantastic eye for detail. She's always had that.
Yeah. maybe I'm gendering that, but anyway, that seemed to be me to be the case. Just, it was this extraordinary blue that he was wearing. It's like, anyway.
Terrific. So I heard you say earlier before we turned on the mic something to the effect of the interview is the story, or something. Maybe you can correct me in a minute. So maybe we can shift now from how this interviewing technique and practice kind of informs the larger kind of audio documentary storytelling that you do.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. When John edits, he edits by the text. He doesn't, I mean, for me, I would always edit by ear. I would listen to the audio. So you're listening to pauses, you're listening to what they don't say as much, or fragments. Whereas with John, it is always about the words. And what I find that does is it gives his scripts a through line. It's the reason he's able to process a vast amount of information, because, habitually you'll interview someone more than once. You'll interview them a few times, especially if they're a master interview, and you'll have a lot of tape. But you're able to really cut through it because you're always looking for the words they say.
Well, the greatest thing there, and this has been a big shift for us, like in 2017, when I think we started with, was it not He'll Be Right, it was a
Slice of Heaven.
Slice of Heaven. I can remember, or
Immigration.
even in the immigration one, but even the one we did with Te Papa or whatever, we were, I'd get the tape and I'd have to transcribe it, like longhand.
Oh no!
And that's not that long ago.
No, it's not that long.
Yeah, living memory.
And I would listen through to the tape once and be like, okay, I think there's a good bit here and here and here, and then I have to go back for painting, literally writing out longhand. Isn't that nuts to think of that? And that's not not that long ago. Whereas now with Otter, and the interesting thing that I notice in terms of my interview technique is that it is always most people now, Otter is very good. You get full paragraphs and they speak reasonably seriously, and there's only a couple of words. Whereas my things are all over the show. It makes no sense at all. These half-formed phrases. It's quite embarrassing. But anyway, I can't remember where I was.
So he uses. So what you were saying, you use Otter to.
Yeah, and it's great. So you just have this massive amount. I mean, when you think about the length. I mean, a book. It's kind of a book length basically. So we do six 6-part series. They're coming up to 10,000 words an episode, so it's nearly 60,000 words, and 80,000 words of
more or less a
standard
book.
book. Yeah, but of course you do have to have all those nuances. You do have the gaps. You have the interplay and all that sort of stuff, and you have to make sure that the audio works. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things to try and slot together.
Yeah, so you start with the text, which is thanks to Otter AI is now transcribed for you. And then what? Do you pick who you think is the protagonist and start there? Are you keyword searching for the threads, or?
No, not a keyword search. It's more a sense of who's, what's the best way of getting into the story? Who's got the first and a kind of ideally slightly surprising angle.
Start with the hook.
Yes, that was some sort of hook, whatever it is. And like so with the service, it was like, the day I turned 10, my mother told me she was a spy, but ideally, if you, I mean, and this is the thing we have. One of the things you wanted to talk about was we have different levels of intimacy with different subjects, right? So the service was quite personal, and I had access to a lot of relatively good inside information. Whereas we did the series Red Line on China, which was incredibly hard. It was, and it was with Guy on, and it was kind of in the same space, sort of political and intelligence area. But we were just, I was massively out of my depth, and it became very, very difficult pulling that all together. So, yeah, anyway, I mean.
And sometimes it's the people, Emma, in Getting Better, embodied the tension. It was her lived experience to be Wahine Maori training to be a doctor in a system that doesn't do right necessarily by Maori. So, and in Dear Jane, everything, this was Jane reckoning with her own past, with her own life. So she herself is encapsulating a whole load of tensions, and then it becomes about getting them out, putting that on the page in a way that is that sort of is available for a listener to connect with and to and to empathize with, even if it is sort of more dramatic than their lives. You know, there's got to be something there you can connect with.
So, yeah, and I noticed that too, right? That those protagonists are like Emma and Getting Better are, as you say, they're emblematic of that tension that is the story. The character is the story in that situation. Yeah. And what about, so maybe going back to this service, I guess your mom, to what extent does that metaphor map on? To what extent is your mom the story? But I guess, I'll leave it there. To what extent is, or did you have a different approach?
It was because it was for me as a kind of an individual. It was that way. It allowed me to tell the story from quite a particular point of view, because, and the very thread of the story about this raid on the Czech embassy or whatever comes from something my stepfather said to me. So in the family living room kind of thing, it wasn't an official interview, and basically the entire series, and this is the great thing about podcasts, right? The entire series is about trying to get a second source for this thing that my stepfather said to me over a drink like 20 years ago. And that my mother was kind of like, it's gonna. She's, only willing to say a certain amount, and I think we all have things inside our families that might not be,
a raid on the secret.
Yeah, but we all have these kind of understandings, and what do we really understand about the way our family works and what happens outside the bounds of the living room? And I think so people were able to map themselves onto that quite quickly. I mean, in a funny sort of way. I mean, Noelle also works as a writer, and so she had enormous success with her memoir about her family as well. So I mean,
and when that book came out, and people
say the title.
That book is called Grand: Becoming My Mother's Daughter. John came up with the title. It's good.
We've got a lot of stuff out of our mothers that have been great. Unofficial work.
Creative, generative energies
right.
there.
Yeah.
Totally. But the interesting thing about that book, I think, is like when people came up to talk to me about it, they talked to me about their mothers and their families. And it's exactly what John is saying. The details change, but the story's the same.
So tell me, where do you guys imagine yourself on this? Like, if a live radio interview is a bit more of that kind of traditional journalistic objectivity and distance from the subject versus characters in your own story to some extent in terms of the role you've played in the service, John, and the role that you play, say, even in something like Dear Jane, which is Jane's story, but you're that go-between character between the two in some ways. To what extent do you see yourself as literary journalism or some kind of audio documentary, if that's different or the same, or journalism? Like, how do you imagine what you're creating?
Look, it's a good question, and in a funny sort of way, in terms of, I think it changes. It changes from podcast to podcast for a start, and depending on the subject. And I think it's always good. I think it's always good to if you can bring a personal and emotional insight into a situation. I mean, the Fair Game, the one I did on rugby with the Pacific, stemmed a lot of that from playing with Pacifica rugby players. And stuff that I shared with them and they told me. So I had finding ways of being able to tell stories that engage people in a more intimate way than the flat out journalism is something that podcasts,
so it's about intimacy.
That's a great strength. So it is. We were talking about the New Yorker long form kind of New Yorker thing, but there's a twist on that as well, isn't there? In terms of the trust, the way people talk. I think if they trust you as a narrator, as someone who tells a story, then that gets you that much further down the line in terms of your engagement, right?
But it's a weightier responsibility. When John was doing those interviews for Fair Game, I know that weighed on you because, you had so much respect for the players you were interviewing with, and you went back with them a long way, some of them. And, it changes how you approach, I mean, for me personally, I think now I'm addicted to it. I'm addicted to being able to bring my whole self, and sometimes there are parts of the story that don't need any of you. You just need to tell it, but then there is often a way of bringing your own engagement with your subject matter and laying that out for an audience. And that's the intimacy, and that's the vulnerability sometimes, because, there's long bits of Dear Jane where I sort of didn't know what I was doing, and I was documenting that in real time. So you do kind of have that little Graham Greene shard of ice as well. You're like, oh, I'm really confused. I better tell my mix pre.
Do the tape on.
And I think that's okay. Like, I think that's part of the medium. It's part of what the medium encourages, and it's appropriate. But we're working on a podcast at the moment, which on one level is kind of a historical crime story, but on another level is kind of personal in some ways that we're trying to navigate right now. And we don't know how we're going to present that yet, but it is very much a part of the sort of wrapping up of the story, and yeah, I think those are the podcasts I love. Those are the podcasts I like to listen to. I was talking about Where is George Gibney, which is an Irish, I think it's Irish and BBC collab. And I really enjoyed not just the craft of that, but also the perspective of that, because I think the guys who were looking for George Gibney, who was this swimming coach who'd abused some of his pupils, they were coming from a sports background themselves. And so their connections with the interviewees reflected that. So I think, we were talking this morning when we were walking, John, about that story you did years and years ago about West Point when you were working for L'Equipe in France. And, I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think you would have written a different story if you hadn't been a professional sports player, right?
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. And that was one of the things that got me in.
West Point's the military academy in the States.
Yeah. I did a story there for the French magazine, L'Equipe. On there they have a rugby team. Anyway, yeah.
Oh yeah, interesting. I wanted to pick up one more thing on the storytelling there. You said something about the intimacy and about the this bring your whole self to it. And the word trust came up. I think you said it, John. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know, because often the idea in kind of mainstream journalism, 20th century, was that trust is built by this objectivity, this nonpartisan, this whatever. But actually, and of course, we've seen what's happened to journalism in the past 20 years plus. But I do hear this word come up often, that this intimacy, this vulnerability, this bring your whole self can create a sense of trust. Is that your sense as well, or is that at odds with our journalistic ethos, or where does trust play in this kind of storytelling that you guys are involved in?
I think it's simply that you go into any interview situation in good faith, that you're not going to try and stiff someone effectively, you're not setting them up, and that you genuinely want to hear their point of view and give them the opportunity to tell their side of the story. And I think that comes, the very fact of believing that yourself, the person you're talking to believes it too, and straight away you're in a space where there can be an exchange that has a real integrity to it, because everyone has a point of view that's valid to some extent. I mean, I haven't really ever. I can't think of having ever interviewed someone who I was
absolutely opposed to.
Yeah. I mean,
you haven't, but I think it's interesting.
But even then, you want to hear why and tell me this. Tell me why you think that, or whatever, so that we can grapple with it together.
Yeah, and when I think of trust, I think one of the reasons I loved live radio, and I still love it, is because of how unmediated it is in certain ways. And one of the first things you learn when you do it regularly is your audience, if they're texting you or emailing you or whatever they're doing, have it like an innate sense of fairness, and they are on it. They're like, you did not give him a fair go. You were talking over him. You were not listening properly. This isn't a good interview. You'll get your feedback in real time. And I do love that, because with live radio, I think it is a trusted medium. Even if you're texting in to say you shouldn't be doing this, you're going too hard, whatever. And you'll get 50-50 both sides. You went too easy on them, especially if it's political. But an audience can hear what you're doing in real time. And I guess I'm I'm grateful we have a production company, because it means like a lot of those relationships, when you're getting people to talk, they do need to trust you. You're asking an awful lot of them. Like they don't get to read the scripts. They don't even get to check their quotes. You know, they let me into their homes and I can tape for an hour and I'm allowed to take that home and do whatever we want with it. You know, that is a very high level of trust, which means, you know, our collaborations with platforms and all of those things, we have to take that trust of our subjects into account, you know, and I think that's something that's important to us in the work we do. And the great thing about long form podcasts is they're long form. Do you know, I'm able to say to people, this isn't a sound bite, you know, this isn't 3 minutes. You're going to get your story told over time and space.
And we kind of embrace complexity. Like sometimes someone will say something that contradicts something else that's either been said or that they may have said themselves, or, you know, and it's like, well, you know, we just sit with it. You know, too bad. Then that's.
And you trust your audience. You trust your audience to know that we all contain multitudes and that we change our minds from time to time and from situation to situation.
Yeah, none of the people whose stories you tell feel like two-dimensional characters, right? They feel very, they feel complex, which is I think how humans are. That's
People blow my mind.
But I think I think it's a really valuable thing in terms of the ongoing battle, as it were, for media. Well, I don't know how would I put this, to keep people listening and agreeing to a kind of common set of values around media and how we understand the information that helps us navigate the world.
Or even a common conception of truth, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's embracing complexity and that sense of, well, we have you know, we won't necessarily all agree, but that's fine. We can hold space for that. I think that's, super.
Yeah, and podcasts like this kind of long-form journalism makes space for that. Yeah. Speaking of complex issues, a number of your podcasts bring up questions of gender and sexism and patriarchy and masculinity. And,
that's all John.
Right? I'm you know, it's he'll be right about, you know, masculinity and Aotearoa, but it's also, you know, Venus Envy and it's Dear Jane, right? Like a lot of it's a common thread in your work, which I really appreciate. I'm curious to know, tell us more about that theme and its continual presence in your work.
Gender. Well, I think it reflects us, doesn't it? We're sort of, you know.
You're the diversity hire there.
No, you are. I think so, and it reflected the times when we started.
I think that was. I think we're quite omnivorous. I wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah.
But Me Too was such a massive thing in 2017 as we were starting, and then it kind of it cast a very big shadow over culture and society.
I was certainly thinking about it
for 3 years. Yeah, and we discussed it at the heart of our relationship quite a lot.
Robust conversation.
Yeah. And there was all, and the culture and colour of Noel's.
And he's always been, I think you've always been interested in masculinity and, you know, playing professional sport and sort of whether it's sport or
soldiering. There's a lot of stereotyping, right? That's the issue for me, is that you ended up with a lot of, very flat stereotypes, which I found pretty annoying. So I guess that was, that was kind of the driver behind He'll Be Right. And I don't know, I mean...
I suppose with Dear Jane, that was very much, you know, a reckoning, a revisiting of something that looked like one thing. I think we are in a very interesting moment in time, you know, especially for women of my generation. Like Jane and I are the same age. We had the same cultural touchstones, all of those same things. So, you know, a lot of her experience, I could absolutely relate to it and sort of see myself in it, you know, and I'm interested in that. But I think for us, more than anything, it's about the story. You know, it's about the story and the character. And does this story have this sort of sufficient complexity for us to be able to get into it, you know, from a few different entry points, and complicated. Like, is it complicated enough? We kind of like a complex story, don't we?
Yeah, and I don't want to paint your work as only focused on gender. Obviously, everything from espionage to climate change and in between, right? But even in the espionage narrative, right? Like, too often spies are about men, right? And you've got your mum here who's played a critical role identifying the blue fabric, right? Or whatever it is, right? So I just, I think that at least I, as a listener, appreciate that you bring that lens to your work.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have you encountered sexism in podcasting? Has been a blokey kind of affair for a while. It's diversifying in some ways, but even sometimes when I go to conferences, it's a lot of dudes who look like me. Have you encountered it in your work at all?
I think New Zealand isn't as representative of that in some ways. You know, like I'm friends with Kirsty Johnston, who did Nellie's Baby, a podcast this year. Fantastic podcast, you know, about a woman's story and an intergenerational story. Melody and Kirsten from Pop Sock. You know, there's a lot of independent producers here and podcast makers who are women. What about you? What do you think? Is it blokey?
I haven't suffered.
So
I wouldn't want to send to my story from here on
in. Well, you started by talking at the very beginning about when you started Bird of Paradise, about the different partnerships and collaborations that you've been involved in, and you named some of them from Te Papa to Auckland Zoo to Massey and also just about spin-off from RNZ and there's a lot of the major media companies. Can you tell us a little bit more about how those partnerships came to be or what that relationship is like between Bird of Paradise and your partnerships?
Yeah, it's it's that complex and sophisticated. You know, it's a dance really. You get in, you open up to begin with people. You have a line of communication, you start talking to them, you find a mutual interest or you don't. I mean, they don't always work out, as it were. I mean, so you have to do a certain amount of research. There's a lot, I mean, relationships are super important, I think, in the industry.
Especially in a small country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so we're in Featherston as well, so we're not in the centre of things. So...
I mean, I think the platforms are different to the sort of collaborations in terms of concepts. You know, you can be approached by an institution who go, our anniversary is coming up and we want to make a podcast. And sometimes then it's a process of saying, okay, what's the story you want to tell and what's the best way of telling that story? And that's kind of John's area because he can kind of zero in on, you know, like with Te Papa, it's about the taonga and it's about the stories that they literally hold, you know, they sort of embody. But then the going to find a platform and the platform that's best aligned with that or the platform that you'll need for New Zealand On Air funding, you know, that's a massive part of being an independent company and it takes a lot of our time and a lot of our energy and it can be, you know, it can be very challenging because all of that development work, you've got to be doing it all the time, don't you? You know, like we've always got to be thinking about the next thing and the next project. And especially because they take a long time and, you know, what people don't see and what they shouldn't see, you know, there's no reason why they should see is the length of time it takes, you know, from the initial concept of getting better. I think it took us, you know, maybe a year to get funding for the project and we were knocked back.
A year to get funding and then how much longer to do production?
Production was quite fast because we had so much, COVID, I suppose. No. It was.
But also, and it took you ages to get a pānui together. Or whatever.
Yeah. There was
you had a production schedule that said, right, this will take 12 weeks or something. And then you were like 4 weeks in like, I haven't got past the pānui.
And what John is talking about was at the development we worked with Gabriel Baker, who's an incredible consultant who works in health equity, who helped us to formulate pānui to connect with Māori whānau who had first-hand experience of inequity in health, you know, and that was how, if you listen to Getting
like
Better.
The Wallace family.
The Wallace family. Yeah. Tina Wallace, an incredible mum and wife and wahine Māori. And, you know, that process, that was my first time working in Te Ao Māori and it was something that, you know, took time. And we needed to do it.
We just wanted a story, but there was a right way of going about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
that's all learning, isn't it? But these things take time. They take a lot of time. The service took time for different reasons. Fair Game took time for different reasons. You have to travel for that. They all just take time. And funding is not a given. You know, sometimes the best projects, you just don't know how you're going to get them funded, or it's not the right time.
And sometimes you just don't.
Or someone else puts into the same funding round with the same idea, you know, and you've got a duplication. All these things that can happen, which you have no control over, really.
Yeah. And so try to give us a little more example here. So say something like Getting Better is a year from concept to getting funded, and then a year from, you know, beginning of production to release. In that time, because you said you're always thinking about the next project as your independent company. In that 2-year span that you're working on one podcast, what else are you juggling as a production company, as an example?
Well, so like all of that, you're kind of like a farmer who has to keep tilling the soil. I'm not sure that's a good parallel. But anyway, you've got it, or a garden, or
Very
you've just
rustic
got to keep,
sort of metaphor.
You've got to keep turning over just to have ideas, right? You know, like, because I mean, actually, you might have 10 different ideas of which you develop 2. But you've got to be reading newspapers, magazines. You've got to be listening to podcasts. You've got to be. There's all this other sort of mulch that goes into having some sort of thing in order to have a fertile enough imagination to be able to get to, you know, the next bit, because we are very omnivorous, you know, so many different things.
I think I was writing a book during Getting Better. Made it, that was an unusual.
Almost all the time over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I'm working, and I've been writing a second book, so that butted up against Dear Jane. And there was a couple of other things, I think, you know, and then we have.
I spend a lot of time in development on just, you know, so we've got like 3 or 4 other things in various stages of advancement as well. And so this is the first time ever, touch wood, that we've got to a point where we have our work for the next sort of 6 months to a year.
Where we know what we'll be.
We're coming to the end of one, and we've got another one coming. So it's an existential threat kind of all the time.
Sure.
Plus, you also just have the logistics. You know, we produce each other. We're producers as well. So you've just got all of your different production and linguistics, and then you've got to make sure that, you know, the school holiday sort of handout on the fridge is adhered to as well.
So you would, I mean, broadly speaking, you're always trying to overlap. This is the first time, the one we're doing at the moment is the first time we've worked together on something for quite a while. Most of the time it's been, you know, I might be doing the service while you're doing. Yeah,
so that's a project called Mr. Asia, Forgotten History, which will possibly be out by the time people can hear this conversation. And that's the first time John and I have done a 2-hander.
Yes,
did we do a 2-hander? We've never done it before. Yeah.
Okay, so something new for Bird.
Yeah, it is.
So traditionally, then one of you is driving the story, and the other is producing it, and then vice versa.
Well, to some extent, like I mean, I took quite a backseat on Getting Better and Dear Jane. I mean,
in some ways, but in other ways, he's always there for script, because he is the person who can identify John as the person who'll say, that's the story. I remember there was a moment in Getting Better where it was some tape of Emma doing an interview with someone who was just torn about something that was happening in his community. And I remember John showing me the text and saying, see that there? That's conflict. That means it's drama. And it was one of those moments, you know, it really was that moment where I go, oh, okay, I get it. Yeah, it was. And it was a small moment, but it was everything, you know, so there is always that. He is always sort of in the background showing me how to think of the story, you know, how to conceptualize it, except for this book that I'm writing at the moment. That's
right. It's the first time I've been shut out.
For now.
Just for now. Exactly. Thank you, Collin. That's extremely diplomatic of you.
Well, thank you for the interview. And is there anything else you want to kind of touch on or kind of plug? You already mentioned Mr. Asia.
Mr. Asia, A Forgotten History.
Okay.
I mean, there'll be a lot of listeners of a certain vintage who'll know what we're talking about. It was a heroin syndicate that for a brief and shining moment were the biggest and the best in the world at drug dealing. We've been told that. It's a difficult metric.
World leading,
to prove.
Award winning.
Until everything just degenerated into murders and, you know, terrible things.
Yeah, it's a very interesting sort of slice of, as it were, the can-do Kiwi dream kind of thing that also has the very darkest sides of, kind of greed and
violence and depravity. But a jump shift in New Zealand culture as well, because this is in lots of ways a moment when drugs sort of enter the picture in a volume that hadn't really been seen before.
Yeah, it's kind of loosely, we've been, for some time actually, this is one of the things that we haven't been able to get up, was looking at methamphetamine in New Zealand. Drug court, we did it, we tried to get a series out on drug court. So we've been thinking about this for quite a while, and in a funny sort of way, we've found that actually the easiest way, because so much of this is evolving rapidly at the time, and we're not news journalists, by being able to put ourselves back 40, 50 years ago, we could say, well, we can see the whole story here. We know how it kind of starts and finishes, and we can also see the long knock-on effects, because, as Noelle was saying, this is the time that you had this jump shift, so you start getting a professionalization of drug trafficking. It's not just hippies bringing back a little bit of, this is when people start bringing things overland, or by boat or whatever, in from Thailand, from the Golden Triangle. You have a very sophisticated business and that's now what we're seeing still with methamphetamine, but all of this stuff was kind of laid down 40, 50 years ago. And, the way police try to combat it, and sort of fascinating characters doing terrible things.
Yes.
So we were watching The Wire before.
Okay, it does sound very Wire-esque.
Yeah. And it was funny, we were talking to the head of organised crime, the New Zealand Police's head of organised crime, and he was saying he'd watched The Wire, and anyway, blah, blah, blah.
But he did say he doesn't watch a lot of cop shows because he's busy policing.
Yeah.
He's got the
living
real
it.
thing.
Yeah.
He's living it, exactly. But John always wanted to make The Wire.
Well, a version of it.
It's
Anyway,
hard
but
not
so
to
this is
watch.
yeah.
So we've got that to look forward to.
That's terrific. Yeah. And it seems like that, looking, rather than so much of kind of traditional journalism is looking at the problem right now, but you have the space in this kind of longer format to really unpack how the hell did we get here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. And so I'm in the final episode at the moment, just writing it. And so what happens off the back of big heroin addiction in New Zealand, brought about by this kind of supply side economics of all the heroin coming in, is then it's cut off, and then you get people doing what's known as home baked morphine. So they find ways of making their own morphine and heroin, which ultimately sort of lays down the tracks for people making their own methamphetamine. But anyway,
Save it, John.
Something to look forward to.
Save it for the screen.
Terrific. Yes. Well, yeah, we'll have links to all this stuff in the episode description. Thank you so much again. It's been a real pleasure to interview you both.
Thank you very much, Collin. Thank you for coming to Feathers.
Yeah.